I am Rachel Miller, and I teach 8th grade language arts at MMW.
And I'm Paula Hoff, the principal at MMW.
When we start teaching the Holocaust unit in 8th grade every year, we inevitably get the question from a student, why do we study this when it happened over 75 years ago? It's actually very simple. The lessons we can learn from this event are invaluable, and the concepts of prejudice, hate speech, and anti-Semitism are all issues that we are still dealing with in our world today. In fact, the lack of awareness and understanding of the Holocaust is on the rise. A recent CNN article stated that the concern isn't only that the Holocaust is fading from memory, it's that the lessons that can be applied to the ongoing human rights abuses and threats to democracy are also being lost. As educated and caring adults, we need to teach about this difficult subject so our students in our community will be informed citizens of world events. We also want our community to be kind, empathetic, and compassionate. We strive to teach that remembering begins with how we treat people every day in our lives. And this is what led us to Dr. Bornstein and Ms. Hollenstadt.
Having a primary source available to us who has lived through the Holocaust is a rare opportunity that helps us better understand our history. Two people that help us remember this difficult history are Michael Bornstein and his daughter, Debbie Hollenstadt. Dr. Bornstein is a survivor of the notorious Auschwitz concentration camp. 6 years after his liberation, he immigrated to the U.S. He graduated from Fordham University and earned his PhD from the University of Iowa. Now retired, Michael lives in New York City. His daughter Debbie is a producer for the NBC and MSNBC News in New Jersey. She's worked with her father for 2 years, helping him research and write his memoir, The Survivors Club. The true story of a very young prisoner of Auschwitz, and we welcome them here this evening to share their story with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Again, I want to thank the Minnetonka District School System for inviting us here today. Minnesota holds a very special place in my heart because this was one of the first places that I spoke publicly. It was in 2015. And my son Scott, an attorney in New York, had a connection to an organization called Smurls. They asked me to speak at a luncheon, and I said yes. I was extremely nervous, like I am today. I spent most of my life trying to avoid talking about the Holocaust. I tried to hide the tattoo on my arm, and whenever I could, I even thought about having it removed. But now I'm glad that I didn't. I realize it's my job to talk about the Holocaust because there aren't that many survivors that are left, and I can't stay silent anymore. I was prisoner B1148. You probably can't see that. At the age of 4, I wore a prisoner uniform. I was starving, too malnourished to grow hair, and I was taken away from my mother, my father, and big brother Samuel. People always ask what I remember. I was young. It's hard to be sure what I remember and what my relatives told me. I do seem to remember the smell at Auschwitz. It smelled like burning flesh. I remember the sound of boots marching. When I ride crowded New York City subways, we also have an apartment in Manhattan, so ride a lot of subways, I get anxious thinking about a cattle ride car to Auschwitz. It's not comfortable for me to stand here and talk about any of this, but I won't stop talking. There were deadly attacks at 2 synagogues in just the last 9 months. I think most of you probably have heard about that. There's been a surge in hate crimes against Jewish people, Black people, Muslim people, Hispanic people, and LGBT minorities. It has to stop. So I'll keep talking. And I thank the people of Minnesota for once again being so gracious and welcoming. It means so much to me that you care. I ask that you remember my story and remember the 6 million who were killed in the Holocaust. Together, let's make sure that history is never forgotten and never repeated. Now my daughter Deborah has a few words.
So lately, I find myself thinking a lot about one particular picture in the slideshow that we're gonna use to tell you my dad's story. That photo there on the bottom right, that's my Grandma Sophie on the bottom right, my dad's mother, and that's her with some of her siblings and her mom, and they look so happy. This was taken just before the war, carrying her pretty little clutch bag and wearing her pretty hat. And they had no clue what was coming. There were signs of growing anti-Semitism in Europe at the time. In Germany, there was propaganda, anti-Semitic propaganda. There were cartoons of Jewish people, short with big noses, holding bags of money. Across Europe, vandalism, graffiti at Jewish synagogues and businesses. But the world just kind of accepted it, and so did my grandma's family. They didn't love it, obviously, but they accepted it. And this photo is my reminder that the Holocaust did not start with concentration camps, or as my dad said, the smell of burning flesh. It started with mean-spirited jokes in Der Stürmer magazine and graffiti, and then matches to synagogues, and then cracked glass. It's a reminder of why the shooting at the Chabad synagogue in California and the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh and the mosque in New Zealand, that's got to be a wake-up call. We cannot pretend the rise in hatred isn't happening. In 1939, my grandma, my aunts, my uncles, they never could have imagined what awful things could come from bigotry ignored. Today, we know. In my own son's middle school last year, 3 boys were suspended for sending around a text chain that was titled, "Kill all the Jews." And we live in a really nice community, just like this one, where I know you guys had an incident that was really upsetting too. And as Rachel was telling me earlier from your schools, that's not a reflection. The student said that's not us, or the principal was telling me that that's not us. That's not a reflection on us. That's not who we are. You could say that at our school too. It's still happening though, and we can't ignore it. The comments in that text chain that was sent around in the middle school included several references to the Holocaust. When the boys' parents, these 3 boys who were suspended, when the boys' parents found out about all of this, they were furious that their sons were suspended. They said it was all a joke. So I guess what I hope that hearing my dad's story does, I hope it's an understanding of why, it provides people with an understanding of why stereotyping is so dangerous, whether it comes from students or politicians, why jokes about Jewish people or any minority group are so threatening, why jokes about the Holocaust are so incredibly hurtful, and why we need to remember the past. To the kids in the room, and I'm so glad that there are some kids here tonight. Thank you so much to the parents who brought them. The reality is that when you grow up and you have kids of your own one day, they're probably never going to get to hear firsthand from a Holocaust survivor, unless they hear from my dad, because he's going to live forever. Right, Dad? But you can tell them I saw Michael Bornstein roll up his sleeve and show his tattoo. The atrocities of the Holocaust were real, and they can never be forgotten. Tell your kids one day, I know what happens when we don't take signs of hatred against any marginalized group seriously. And with that, we do want to take you through my dad's story in pictures. We're really lucky that not only did my dad survive, but you'll kind of understand why at the end so many family photos survived as well.
Okay, before World War II, we had a happy Orthodox Jewish family. My father, Israel Bornstein, was a successful accountant. My mother, Sophie, loved to dance and sing, and family was happy together.
So my grandma Sophie, My grandma Sophie had 6 brothers and sisters. They were a family of 7 siblings, and as my dad said, they were all a close-knit Jewish family.
And here's a map of Poland, and you see the town I was born in is highlighted, southern part, called Żarki, and right above it is a town called Częstochowa, where they have the Church of the Black Madonna, if you've heard that before.
One of the things we learned in our research is that Żarki was one of the first towns invaded when the war started, and it was a horrible invasion. Within 24 hours of declaration of war, there were bombs, aerial bombers that pretty much decimated the town of Żarki. Within 48 hours, there were boots on the ground in Żarki. Turns out, actually, that wasn't supposed to be the case. That wasn't what was supposed to happen. But the first night of the war, Polish infantry tucked themselves, sort of retreated for the night into the town of Żarki, just to kind of hide and get some rest. And in the morning, they saw some German observation planes that just happened to be flying overhead, and they did something really foolish. They took out their guns, and they shot at the planes. Didn't do anything to the planes, but just a few hours later, bombers returned, and as I said, decimated the town. Among the atrocities committed, whole families were made to line up against a wall, and they treated it like a game, the German Wehrmacht, the soldiers. They said, if you get tired and you lower your hands, you'll be shot. Many people were killed in Żarki on a day that's remembered as Bloody Monday, September 4th, 1939, in that way. I debated when I was working on the book about whether to include those details, because I knew I was writing for young readers. And after discussion actually with my own kids and with my own mom, with the editor, I finally decided that you should be shocked the first time you hear about the Holocaust. It should be horrifying. This is what happened, and people do need to remember. But I did go out of my way not to make sure it's not gratuitously awful, because again, I wanted young readers to be able to sit down and read this. Something else we learned that happened right at the start of the war, my grandma Sophie wanted to check on her parents one day, and she took a shortcut through the Jewish cemetery, hoping to avoid seeing the German soldiers. And she heard loud shouting, and she witnessed something that would haunt her really for the rest of her life.
Yes, my mother tells a story about seeing a Nazi soldier, a Jewish family, a man, a woman, and a little girl. The Nazi asked the man to dig a little pit. He asked the family to strip, to hug. He killed them all and shoved them into the pit. And again, my mother just absolutely cannot stop talking about that. So these are the symbols of the Nazis. Jewish people had to wear a band which had a Jewish star and the word Jude, which stands for Jew, in the middle of it. And you see on the right, my aunt and uncle, on their wedding day, my uncle had to wear that armband. So I was born in ghetto life on May 2nd, 1940. I think you guys can all count. That makes me 39 years old.
This month.
And again, I had a big brother, Samuel Shlomo. and Jarkey was an open ghetto.
So a lot of people, when you think of ghettos, when you first learn about ghettos, for the most part you hear about those big encampments where Jews are herded into these encampments and there's barbed wire fencing around them. But actually, more common than not, in Poland at the time, people lived in open ghettos. So it was towns that had checkpoints to get in and out of town, and there were severe restrictions, but people did live in their own homes. There were severe food shortages as well. People were hungry. In most cases, they couldn't conduct any kind of business or work and get money. And there was also something else for the Jewish people, something that the German soldiers called contributions. They said that the Jewish people needed to contribute to the German government, to the German military. And so they would go knock on a regular basis on the homes of Jewish families, and on one given day it might be, you have to give up a certain amount of money, or your silver goods, or your leather goods, or your jewelry. And so my dad's family did what pretty much every Jewish family across Europe did at that point, and that was they hid whatever they could. So in my dad's family's case, they dug a hole, like a pit in the backyard, and they reinforced it, and they created like a makeshift vault. And they hid as much as they could. And they really, really believed at this point that the war would end quickly, that the Polish government would fight back, and they would have their lives back, and then they would have their things. One of the other things we learned in her research was that my dad's father, Israel Bornstein, was selected to become president of the Judenrat. So each ghetto had a Judenrat, or a Jewish committee, that acted as like a liaison between the Nazis and the Jewish people. So for instance, if the Nazis said, well, tomorrow we need this many men to drag dead bodies, or bodies of horses, or we need this many people to be moved into another camp to do certain labor, or to go to camps, ultimately, death camps. Who made the decision about who did that work and who went on those trains? It was the Judenrat. And so a lot of times Judenrat presidents were seen as traitors among their peers. And I will not lie, I was very nervous as I was digging, because I was afraid of what I might learn or might have to tell my father about his own father. And I was so excited, I don't know how to describe the day that I was having some essays translated, written by one particular survivor who escaped to Israel, who called my dad's father a hero and described a bribery scheme that I then learned about from some other survivors, one who's still alive today. So my dad's father had influence over a particular guard named Schmidt. He was bribing this guard and several other German soldiers to make conditions more bearable for all of the Jewish people in Jarkey, in their ghetto. He obtained travel visas to try and help people escape. And he did something else that you won't find in the book. This survivor asked me not to put it in the book, but he did give us permission to talk about it when we talk to students. It's a man named Marvin Zborowski, and he was about 14 years old. He was on a work detail. He was assigned to a work detail, and one day he couldn't get out of bed.
Yes, Marvin tells the story, and again, we just talked to him today, and he is alive and going to be 91 years old this summer. But he tells a story about being on a work detail. One day, he just couldn't get out of bed. He probably had a fever. And the Nazis came in, put a pillow over his head, dragged him to jail, and the sentence for not going to work was death. And so he was sentenced to death. My father came in, bribed the Nazis, and saved his life. Again, Marvin is still alive today.
And so that was probably one of the best moments along this entire journey, was getting to tell my father that his own father was a hero. Marvin shared this photo with us one day. That's him on the top left, the top left, and the skinny kid there. And he lent it to me to go scan it at Kinko's so I could get a good scan of it. And he said, please don't hurt this photo. This is one of my most prized possessions. And Marvin is a man of a lot of worldly possessions today. He's been very successful in the United States. But he explained to me that this photo is a picture of his secret school. So during the ghetto years, kids couldn't go to school, right? And you guys would probably love that for like a week or two or a snow day here or there, right? But long term, it's not so good, right? Education is so hugely important. And Marvin's dad, Moshe Zborowski, was really upset about this. So he used his secret pot of money to pay this woman on the bottom right, that was their teacher, to school these kids secretly. Next to his teacher is a girl named Sasha, and Marvin said that was his crush. He said it was his girlfriend, but he later said it was his crush. Regardless, he loved Sasha. The reason Marvin cherishes this photo so much is because every single person in this photo was murdered except for him. He is the only survivor from the secret school. That includes his teacher, and that includes his dad, Moshe Zborowski. Marvin survived actually in hiding, along with several other family members, including his sister, who died yesterday. So we were on the phone with him earlier, and he was devastated, obviously. The bribery scheme that my dad's father had set up actually he helped to keep Żarki one of the longest running open ghettos in all of Poland. Again, an open ghetto, not great, but still much better than a lot of the alternatives. And so at some point, though, word came down from higher up that Żarki would be made Juderein. That's German for clean of Jews. And ultimately, my dad, his mom, Sophie, his father, Israel, his big brother, Samuel, and his grandma, Dora, were taken to the Pionki labor camp. And we asked my grandma, Sophie, in the 1980s, it's on video, my dad said to her, well, tell us about Pionki. And my grandma looks off in the distance and she says, oh, Pionki was so wonderful. And when my dad and I were researching for the book, we pulled up that video when we were like, okay, Grandma lost it there. You know, she doesn't remember, right? But the truth is, my grandma Sophie knew exactly what she was talking about. Because we learned in testimony from survivors that Pionki was a beautiful camp set in a beautiful wooded part of Poland. Yes, the prisoners lived within barbed wire, and yes, they worked long hours on a factory floor. It was attached to a huge munitions factory. So prisoners would work long hours packing bullets for the Nazis. Sounds awful, except that within that barbed wire encampment, the prisoners had all the food they could want. They had access to soap and toothpaste, and all these things we so take for granted, right? Things that keep you healthy and safe, and that's all because of a German civilian who ran the camp. They called him Hauptmann Brent, and he was, by all accounts, a really good man. And he was devastated about the treatment of Jews, and he used his position to really take care of these prisoners as best he could. There's so many accounts of amazing things that Hauptmann Brent did, but at some point, in the summer of 1944, word came down again from higher up that Żarki would be made Juderein, clean of Jews. And there was nothing Hauptmann Brent could do to stop it. And his prisoners were taken by train to Auschwitz.
So this is the kind of cattle car that I was talking about before that we were shoved into, and sometimes it took days before you got to a concentration camp. And the cars were stuffed with people, very little air to breathe. And from what I understand, one of my grandparents died in a ride in one of these cattle cars to a concentration camp. So this is the front of Auschwitz, and it says, Arbeit macht frei, which means work will make you free. And that's probably the farthest from the truth that happens when you get into Auschwitz.
So when you arrive, the first stop is the selection gate. That's where the German soldiers basically played God. They decide who lives and who dies. And most of the time, kids were considered completely useless, right? They can't work. And most were killed within 2 weeks, if not immediately, upon arrival at Auschwitz. And I can just tell you, we've spoken to historians, archivists, researchers around the world, and the first question is always, do you have anything that explains my dad's survival, why he survived the selection gate at Auschwitz? And everybody just shakes their head and calls it a miracle. There is no good explanation. But we did learn that Hauptmann Brent, that kind commandant from Pionki, was so upset that his prisoners were being sent to Auschwitz that he sent word to Auschwitz. He said, "These are the best trainloads of workers in the world. Keep them alive." My dad was a 4-year-old boy. He wasn't working anywhere. But we kind of wonder, I mean, we don't know, but we kind of wonder, maybe did those trainloads of people, prisoners, did maybe they received some extra grace? At the very least, every prisoner on a train coming in from Pyeonggi was so much healthier than all of these other prisoners coming in from across Europe. They had been well fed and well cared for. For whatever the reasons, answers we may not know, my dad was, instead of selected to be murdered immediately, he was taken to the children's bunk. There's a children's bunk on the women's side of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And he was taken there, separated from his mom and grandma, who were also on the women's side, but in the women's bunk, and his dad and his big brother. They were taken to the men's side of camp. And everybody said goodbye at that selection gate, hoping that they would see each other again very soon. And my dad was taken to the children's bunk where he probably would have died of starvation were it not for what we call the chutzpah of my grandma Sophie.
So my mother tells a story about, again, me starving. The kids were older in the children's bunk. They were starving too, so they took my bread away, and my mother came into the children's bunk. She was beaten over the head for doing that and shared some of the bread and smelly potato soup with me. So that's one of the miracles that saved my life.
So my grandma Sophie at some point, and I don't know the exact date, maybe I'll never know, but at some point during my dad's 6-month stay at Auschwitz, my grandma Sophie got nervous that my dad would die of starvation if he stayed in the children's bunk much longer. And so she took another big risk. She smuggled him into the women's bunk one night, and she kept him hidden there under straw. I have 3 kids of my own who were all 4 at one point or another. And to me, that's one of the biggest miracles of all. He didn't make a sound. My grandma Sophie said, "Oh, he was such a good hider. He was so quiet. He didn't make a sound." And he stayed hidden. My grandma Sophie didn't just risk her own life in doing that. She risked the lives of all of those women. There were hundreds of women in every bunk. They all could have been killed for hiding a child. And nobody said a word. There was an unwritten code on the women's side of Auschwitz-Birkenau that you look after the children. So the prisoners who were working, for instance, in the garden, they would steal vegetables, tuck them into their undergarments or into their pockets, and they would look for ways to get to the children to give them fruits or vegetables. They would steal things from what's called the Canada warehouse. It's where all your stuff went when you got off the trains, all your suitcases and things, and they would look for things like spoons, which were such a hot commodity at Auschwitz. Why do you think a spoon would be so special? Do you know? Because if you have a spoon, you can share your soup, and you can also drink from puddles if you're thirsty. And so a spoon was really precious. So they would steal things like that, and they would share them with the children. Once my grandma Sophie had my dad safely in her sights, she was desperate to know how Samuel was doing, how my dad's big brother was doing, and how her husband was doing. And so the only way to find out, if you were lucky, is to be able to be working near the electrified fence. There's an electrified fence that separates the men and women's side of camp at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And so if you were lucky, you could try and get information through the fence. And so she was working near the fence one day and saw a group of men, and she said, "Can you find out for me, please, Israel and Samuel Bornstein, how they're doing?" And she found out by the end of the day that they had been murdered in the gas chambers. The gas chambers at Auschwitz, a lot of you have probably heard about. They would tell prisoners that they were going to just take showers, and they had them line up and strip naked, and they would say to them, because they really didn't want to cause any panic, I mean, German people were very meticulous about their planning. They would say, "Remember where you're hanging your uniform, so that, look at the number, remember where your uniform is so you can have it on the way out." But they never came out. Zyklon P gas was spilled into the chambers, and within about 13 to 15 minutes, all of the prisoners were gone. And that's how my dad's brother and his father were killed. And my grandma Sophie said that when she heard that, she just was done. She just had had enough, and she looked at the electrified fence, and she planned to do it. she was going to throw herself against the fence. And the only thing that stopped her was knowing that she still had one son left to protect. She did go back to the women's bunk. And we don't know the exact date again here, but somewhere in that 6-month day, my grandma Sophie was actually selected to be moved out of Auschwitz, which is amazing news. It's the greatest news to leave the worst hell on earth, right? For anybody, except for the person hiding a child. My grandma Sophie had to say goodbye to my dad, and she assumed she was saying goodbye forever. She did not think she would ever see him again in this lifetime. And she left him in the care of his grandma Dora, that's his grandma Dora, and those women in the women's bunk. And then on January 27th, 1945, Soviets came in. Can we roll that video, Matt?
Und Doktormengen suchten sich unter ihnen eine bestimmte Kategorie aus. Alle, die Sie hier als Überlebende sehen, sind Zwillinge.
That's my father on the bottom right.
So we were in Indianapolis watching a movie called The Chosen.
In the 1980s, there was a movie called The Chosen in which the two main characters go to see a movie. And the movie is set in, it's a fictional movie, but it's set in 1945. And they play a real news clip from that time period. My dad's sitting there in the theater next to a woman who's here actually tonight, Terry Schildkraut.
Terry Schildkraut is here.
An old friend from Indiana, and they were sitting there with some friends in Indiana. Go ahead, Dad.
And this is before DVDs were around, so we couldn't get a copy of that.
So he looked up and he saw himself on the screen.
And with a close-up of my tattoo, so I called the producer. He said, "What do you want?" I said, "Well, I want a star role in your next picture." I didn't give you permission for that. But all I wanted was a copy of that, and he wouldn't talk to me anymore. But my wife and I got a big video camera, and the owner of the theater let us take the pictures. So
if you Google that now, which my dad and I did just a couple years ago, if you Google Children Liberation Auschwitz, a million thumbnails will come up that look like that. And my dad and I happened to pick the wrong one to click on one day. Clicked on it and it says, "Do you want to visit the site?" Sure. It took us to something called the Ghetto Revisionist Forum. It's a Holocaust deniers website, and it captioned this video. This video shows the lies Jews have been telling, that children were killed on arrival at Auschwitz. And it captioned this photo, "Pretty healthy children for a, quote, death camp," implying that Auschwitz was not so bad. And that's been fuel for my father, that if the Holocaust deniers are speaking, he needs to speak louder.
we saw that on a computer, and it was time for me to speak and Debbie to write a great book, which made the New York Times bestseller list, by the way.
I was saying before, everybody should work at some point in your life with your father, because it's like the greatest ego trip in the entire world. You just hear how great you are. Although I will say, by the way, for me, Minneapolis brings back some really good memories too, because it was here, right after the book came out, that we were in the Mall of America, and we got a call from the publisher saying, "You just made the New York Times bestseller list." So I'll never forget Minneapolis for that reason either. But back to my dad's story. You'll notice, by the way, throughout this whole thing that my dad will defer to jokes, and I love you, Dad, but that is what he does, and that has been his survival mechanism, I think, through this whole thing. So just giving you some background on that. So we wondered for a long time, why was my dad there when the Soviets got there? Because you may know there was a death march right before liberation. The Nazis knew they were losing. They knew that the Allied forces were getting closer, and they heard the bombing getting closer, and so they made a decision to march more than 60,000 prisoners out of Auschwitz into the woods. They marched for weeks to get them to other camps. Most of them died. Most people died along the way. This was Poland in January. Most people didn't have coats, and some didn't have shoes, and some didn't have food. And a 4-year-old boy would never have survived that march, but my dad wasn't on it. And we learned through documentation that it was saved and now sits in a museum in Jerusalem, Yad Vashem, We learned, it's hard to see here, but his number is down there at the bottom, that my dad had actually been snuck into the infirmary right before the death march. He was being treated for something called dystrophy, wasting away. The timing of that illness saved his life. If he had been on the death march, he would never have lived. Where would my dad and his grandmother Dora go after they survived Auschwitz, but of course back to Żarki, expecting to find nobody. And they couldn't believe it when a short time later, my grandma Sophie returned too. She survived the Austrian labor camp, and my dad and her were reunited. My grandma Sophie, when she got back, was pretty surprised, though, not just to find my father, who she never thought she would see alive, but because she was surprised by where my dad and his grandma were living.
Yes, my mother tells a story about coming back to Żarki, and again, my grandmother went to the house that we owned in Żarki, and some people took the house over, wouldn't let her in, and my grandmother took me to a farm. She found a chicken coop with a board over our head, and that's how we lived, and that's how my mother found us.
My grandma Sophie was surprised by something else when she returned. I had mentioned that she had several siblings, 6 brothers and sisters, right? Nobody knew which path was going to lead to survival when the town was becoming uterine or clean of Jews, right? And so they made different decisions. 2 sisters started out in Warsaw. Her older and her younger sister started out in Warsaw. One fled to Vilna, another town, trekked across Siberia, and ultimately got paperwork from a famous Japanese statesman. His name is Chuni Sugihara, and made it all the way to Japan, and she survived. One sister started out in Warsaw, and she was in the Warsaw Ghetto, Majdanek death camp, Skarżuszko, Buchenwald, and then she was led on a death march out of Buchenwald into the woods. Several brothers went into hiding, hoping that that would be their way of survival, different attics and bunkers. All 7 siblings survived. This is my grandma Sophie on the top right with some of her siblings. That's Aunt Hilda in the middle, her little sister, who was in all those death camps and on the death march. My dad is there without hair, as you can see. So he suffered from malnutrition, and as a result, his hair kept falling out. Even after liberation, for a long time, he couldn't grow hair. And then above Hilda, next to my grandma Sophie, is her brother Sam and his wife Sesha. Sam and Sesha had this little girl Ruth there with the big bow. And they made a decision, Sam and Sesha, to go into hiding. They went to an attic at a farmer's attic on the outskirts of town, a little village called Bobolice. And the farmer and his wife said, well, we'll take you in, but we're not taking the little girl. Because if she cries and someone's coming through here, we could all be caught and we could all be killed. And so Sam and Sesha knew that that made sense, and so they made arrangements. They reached out to a former maid who had worked in their home, and a woman whom they trusted, and they said, we'll pay you a large sum of money if you'll just take Ruth in and raise her as your own. And she agreed. And so plans were made for a handoff in town. And Eli Zborowski, that's Marvin, who I mentioned before, it's his big brother. So he's about 18 or 19 at this point, Eli. And Eli, who was hiding up in that attic, said, I'm going along for this handoff. And he went along with Sam and little Ruth, and he said something just felt weird, like it was nothing more than just a gut feeling. Something just felt weird, and he said to Sam, we need to follow this woman. And they followed until she thought she was out of view, and this woman plunked Ruth down in a snowbank on the side of the road and walked away. And so Sam and Eli scooped her back up, and they bring Ruth back to the attic. And there were actually 10 people hiding in that attic in all, and all of them would go on to say that they would never in their lives forget the sound of Ruth crying every night in her sleep after that. She would cry, don't take me from my mommy, please don't take me from my mommy, because she knew she was going to be taken away again. She had to be. And Sam and Sesha, Sam and several of the family members owned a leather factory in town before the war, and they had a friendship, a relationship with a man named Boyanek. He owned a boot factory, a shoe factory, a shoe store. And so this man, Boyanik, had 5 boys of his own, and he and his wife always wanted a little girl, and they said, we'll take Ruth in, and we'll raise her as our own. Eli would go out on a regular basis. Eli Zborowski, he looked the least Jewish, so he was the least stereotypical. He had blonde hair and blue eyes, and he could sneak out of the attic to check in on Ruth and to make payments to Boyanik for keeping her. And he wouldn't draw so much attention because he had blonde hair and blue eyes, right? But here's the thing, the Polish neighbors knew who Eli Zborowski was. They had lived there for a very long time. So they could have, if they wanted to, point him out to the Nazis. And so he had to go out in disguise. And that, I don't know if you can see that, but that is what looks like a woman in that carriage. That's Eli Zborowski dressed as a farm maiden. That was his disguise.
I just want to mention to you, Eli started the American Society, International Society for Yad Vashem.
Which is a very important organization for Holocaust remembrance. Yeah. I always say, like, you know this kid was a teenager at this point because he literally risked his life to take this picture. Well, who does that? You know, he could have been killed, but he stops for this photo. He shows up one day to check in on Ruth, and Boyanik says, I'm sorry, she's not here anymore. He and his wife got scared. They heard of another family in town that was caught hiding Jews, and they were all killed, and they got scared. And he said, don't worry, we left her in the town of Częstochowa, which my dad mentioned to you at the beginning there on the map, north of Żarki. So Częstochowa is known for something called the Church of the Black Madonna. It's a big, famous monastery, and in the town of Częstochowa, there's a web of church orphanages which were run by nuns at the time. And so they said, we left her outside one of those orphanages, and we know the nuns will take her in, and we know that she will be okay. So Sam and Sasha lived out their days in hiding, not knowing if their daughter is alive or dead. January 18th, 1945 is when Żarki was liberated. And they literally said they jumped onto the back of a train, holding onto the back of a train, and went to Częstochowa. You'll have to read the book. There's a really interesting way that Ruth could prove to the Mother Superior there that Sasha could prove that this was her daughter. But anyway, the Mother Superior says, you can't all go in at once. You're going to scare her. And these are our children now. If she wants to go with you, she can go with you. If she wants to stay with us, she stays with us. And so Sam says, well, I'm her father. I'm going in first. So Sam goes in, and Ruth freaks out. She's like, you're not my father. She doesn't remember him. She was barely 3 last time she saw him. He's been in hiding. He looks different. And she doesn't remember him. And Sam comes out of the room very distraught. And the Mother Superior looks at Sasha and tells her to try. And Sasha went in, and she started to sing. She sang a little song she had sung to Ruth when she was a little girl, a little alphabet song. And Ruth remembered the song, and she knew that she wasn't an orphan anymore. Today, Ruth lives in Florida. She has 3 kids of her own. I thought it was really interesting that her daughter Yafa, so she raised her kids in a really good traditional Jewish home. They keep a kosher home. She gave her kids good Jewish names. Yafa is one of her children. And Yafa said to me, I was moving mommy to a different, she's in a nursing home now. She hasn't been well lately. She said, I was moving her, and you won't believe what I found in the backs of all of her drawers. Any guesses? Rosary beads and crosses. This good Jewish woman who honored her faith, loved her faith, obviously never forgot those early teachings, and she never forgot those women who saved her. And I thought that was so beautiful. So beautiful that I ended up adding it in the latest edition, in the paperback edition. But back to my father's story. He was, as I said, not well. He was sick for a while. So
again, I was not well, emaciated. My mother took me to Munich, Germany. We lived 64 Agnesstrasse, and we lived there waiting for a visa and getting care packages. I think most of you probably heard of care packages, but they were very, very precious to me. There were chocolates, my mother had nylons, clothes, and so it really means a lot. I still donate to care right now because how great they were. And then in February 1951, went on the transport ship SS Stewart.
USNS General MP Stewart. Yes.
And it took about 7 days and 7 nights, and I was throwing up for about 7 days and 7 nights with seasickness. So we came in, U.S. Immigration didn't want sick people coming in. My mother was a good talker, and even though, you know, I had a fever and I was sick, they let us in. And here's a picture of the card. It says DP. You can see displaced person. So basically came to the U.S. as a homeless person. And then
So this is my dad's 6th grade class. He used his Aunt Ola, the one who was saved by Sugihara. She made it to the U.S. first, and she set up a corset shop on the Upper East, was it, Dad, or Upper West Side?
Fifth Avenue, right in
Midtown.
between.
Right in between. So she lived near PS6 and had the better address, much better than my father's address, and so they snuck him into this really good school, one of the best schools at the time, public schools in New York. So he went to PS6 with all kids who came from wonderful, strong backgrounds, and here's my father there. That's him, the second row from the bottom, second from the left, so he was a lot healthier by this point. And I added this photo for a reason, and I added a mention of this in the afterword of the book for a reason. One of the girls in this photo reached out to my dad right before the book came out, and she said, oh, you know, someone remembered, we're planning a reunion of our 6th grade class, and someone remembered that there was this boy with the tattoo, and they were able to track him down from an article that was written about him, and they wanted to know, did he want to come to the reunion? And my dad's like, I can't believe they called me. Nobody ever spoke to me. I was completely invisible in school, completely invisible. And he decided to go, though. He and my mom went to this reunion. And the kids, now in their late 70s, treated him so well and apologized. In fact, my dad mentioned we were working on this book, some wrote letters later, and I included a quote from one of them because she wrote about how she felt, she looks back, and she's looked back many times with shame and regret that she didn't treat him better. You know, I know when I was in 6th grade, and these kids, they didn't bully him, they just didn't pay attention to him. When I was in 6th grade, I was never gonna bully anybody, for sure. But would I have reached out to that kid who came from my dad barely spoke the language. He was poor, and this was in a wealthy area. He had no father, and I don't know, he was so different from them. Would I have reached out? I don't know. And I added it hoping that readers, my own kids and other readers, would do better maybe than I would have done. And just consider that everybody has a story, and you never know what it is.
I just want to ask how we're doing on time.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so basically, one of the people in the 6th grade worked in the New York State Supreme Court, invited us to talk at the New York State Rotunda, and that was really a memorable moment. Another memorable moment was in 1957 when I became a U.S. citizen. Now, I know there's a lot of prejudice in the United States, but frankly, we've been to many, many countries around the world, and I can't think of a better country to live in. I think we're all very, very lucky. And so then in 1958, went to Fordham University.
So I had mentioned Aunt Hilda in that center of the photo, right? My dad's aunt. So she couldn't get into the U.S. initially. She made it to Cuba first. And she calls up my grandma Sophie, who's in the U.S., and my Aunt Hilda had married a Cuban man, and she calls up my grandma Sophie and she says, hey, I want to fix you up with somebody. And my grandma Sophie ended up remarrying, and she moved to Cuba right when my dad was starting school.
So I was starting Fordham University. The dorms were all taken. Again, this is a Jesuit school.
So he was kind of homeless again.
The dorms were taken. They put me up in the infirmary. And this is another time an infirmary saved my life. I had an 8-foot cross in front of my bed, and I got a New York State scholarship, a Fordham scholarship, worked as a waiter in the Catskills 7 days a week, 12 to 14-hour days, but managed to make it. And then in 1962, moved to the University of Iowa, where I received a PhD in pharmaceutics, analytical, and biochemistry. And another thing I received there is my wife. She was studying special education, and after I graduated and she graduated, we got married, and we've been married for over 50 years. Is it 51 years, Deb?
It is 51 years, and I won't tell Mom that you had to ask that. So this is the family now. You have to keep updating this photo because, as you can see, there's babies. I think that's the last update for a while. But you can look at this photo, and you can look at it two different ways. From one survivor, there's all of this, right? 6 million people were killed. What would have been today? Each one deserved this. Each one should have had this. But then we also look at it and we think, from one survivor, there's all of this. You know, our Passover gathering last week, a couple weeks ago, our birthday party celebration this past week for my nephew Daniel. Every time we get together, we're 22 around the table from one survivor. And in this picture is my daughter Ellie Sophia, Sophie from my grandma Sophie. There's my sister Lori Eileen, the I after Israel Bornstein. Who else? Oh, Jack Samuel, my son Samuel, of course, from my dad's brother Samuel. And so we're just blessed, very blessed. Something else we're blessed with when the family gets together to celebrate on happy occasions, and we call them simchas in the Jewish religion. I had mentioned that my Grandma Sophie and my Grandpa Israel, they had hidden as much as they could before the war in that makeshift vault in the backyard. And you know my Grandma Sophie's house was taken, but if you knew my Grandma Sophie, you knew she was getting her stuff back. She snuck into the backyard of her old home in Zarki before she left, and she dug until her fingernails literally bled, and she found the makeshift vault, but everything had been stolen, except for one thing that I guess vandals didn't want.
And that one thing is this Kiddush cup. It's a cup that's filled with wine and used for blessings. So we've had it in our wedding, our children's weddings, bar mitzvahs, bat mitzvahs.
That's my son's bar mitzvah in December, yeah.
And other celebrations. So it means a lot to us. The other thing that my mother gave me was this watch. And the back of it, there's Hebrew letters having a gimel and a zayin. It stands for something in Hebrew called Gam Ze Ya'avor, which means this too shall pass. So we talk to a lot of kids and adults for that matter, and not everyone has a perfect day. And so remember, Gam Ze Ya'avor, remember this too shall pass. Look forward to the future, and hopefully it'll be a bright day.
So one thing I really wanted to find in my dad's research, when I was researching for my father, was something tangible, maybe like a birth certificate from his brother. We never thought to ask my Grandma Sophie what Samuel's birth date was. And so we can't even mark that day. And I thought for sure I would find that. I found birth certificates for everybody else. And I didn't find it. But about 2 or 3 weeks before the book came out, before the hardcover came out, so you won't find it in the hardcover, but in the paperback you will, I was in touch with a researcher in the northern UK who has a connection to this little town of Zarki, and she knows the man whose dad owned the only photography studio in the area at the time of the war, before, during, and right after the war. And she was in touch with this man's son, who's sitting on a cache of photo negatives that have never been before shared publicly. And she convinced him to let her look at them and use them for her research purposes. And then once we were in touch, she got permission for me to look through these photos. And after much searching, we finally found this. That is my dad's brother, Samuel. And I called my dad. He was in Florida at the time that I finally found this. And I called him up, and then I called again. Then I called Marvin Zborowski to confirm that that was him. And then I called him back, and my dad said, "We're already at Staples, and we're blowing it up to a life-size picture." So he was really excited about that. And we thought that's where the story ended. And then, 2 months after the book comes out, right? We have a website set up at this point, and we get an email through the website from this woman who says, "I'm the little girl sitting next to you on the front of the book." And we found out on the very same day about another little girl sitting next to my dad on the front of the book. And would you believe that these three, Sarah Ludwig, Tova Friedman, and my dad, for decades have been living just miles apart in New Jersey and never realized it. As Sarah Ludwig says, we're kind of all family now. And it was such an amazing day. We reunited with all the kids and the grandkids. And actually, NBC Nightly News was there and covered it. You can Google that if you want. I know, I'm sorry, I'm making people cry, but it's a happy ending, right? Like, it's a really, really good happy ending. And so we never know what the next chapter will be, but I will say that probably the most important chapter of all is knowing that schools care about this story, that students and adults are reading it, and we're thrilled to see it's being used in curriculum around the country. My dad is now pen pals with kids around the country. He gets letters from kids who, in like the middle of nowhere, Iowa, where people probably have never met anybody Jewish, from kids saying, "Well, I have a learning disability," or "I have a physical disability," or "I've been bullied, and I'm always going to remember Gam Ze Ya'avor." These kids quoting Gam Ze Ya'avor.
And I still get letters from some of those kids, and it's really great. But thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.